Creatures of the Night, it's your girl Tati. Let's talk about Dark Side of the Ring Season 6, Episode 6, Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert. For this episode, we have interviews from Jim Cornette, Medusa, Mick Foley, Dutch Mantel, Ricky Morton, Doug Gilbert, and ECW founder Todd Gordon. Now, for this episode, I'm telling you, they start off by letting you know exactly how old he was when he passed away. And when you think about someone passing away at 33, that is super young. By the time you're 33, you're kind of all right, maybe I'm halfway to death. Or you kind of feel like, shit, I don't think I did anything yet with my life. And you're still looking for what fulfills you in life. And I'm just thinking about it. I'm just sure, he's had a career, he's had accomplishments. And as a pro wrestler, he's got to do a lot of things. But 33 is so young. Now, he is the son of Tommy Gilbert, who was a popular wrestler in Tennessee in the 60s and 70s. His brother Doug also became a wrestler as well. When he was young, he is watching his father wrestling, and he just felt like he had this connection with pro wrestling where he's backstage and he's watching, and he in his heart, he wants to be a booker, but he's learning a lot of things that is very interesting to him in terms of pro wrestling, and he becomes a wrestling photographer. And with doing that, he meets Jim Cornette, and they are of the same age at this time, and they are both getting their feet into the professional wrestling world as photographers. By the time he is 18 years old, he is tagging with his father, learning how to be a wrestler. And as he's doing singles matches, he's having feuds, and especially with his best friend, Ricky Morton. They even have the legendary first concession stand match back in 1979, and Jim Cornette points out that that match was what encouraged Onita to bring that hardcore style to Japan. So thank you, Ricky and Eddie, for that hardcore style that we have now in Japan. We do appreciate it. However, he is having success within wrestling at different territories, but he ends up going to WWF, making a little bit more money, a little bit more, eyes, and becoming a little bit more popular than when he was wrestling in the territory. However, one night on his way to meet Vince McMahon Sr., he gets into a horrible car accident where he's left in critical condition. His neck was broken. The steering wheel crushed his chest, and he had other injuries within that car accident. And many of the doctors said, hey, you're never going to get back in the ring, yet alone a lot of other normal things that people do every single day. And guess what? Like other wrestlers, he is back in the ring in 3 months. Now, what makes this even worse is that he doesn't really have much of a recovery time, because wrestlers have that thing where if they don't see me, they will forget me. Is that a lie? Not really, but you almost died. Your neck was broken, and it's you need a lot more time to get better. Now, he gets somewhat better. He's back into the ring, and this is where they end up taking his accident. Fans knew about it. They put it in terms of a storyline and have one of his opponents re-break his neck. And this time, as his neck is broken, he is being seen by the WWF doctor, who is just prescribing all types of painkillers left and right. And there is the start of the addiction that he has to painkillers. Now, the more and more that Eddie is at the WWF, he's realizing this is a little bit too much show business, not as much as what he is used to in terms of wrestling. And he's thinking, you know what, I should just go back to Memphis. They're going to bury my ass anyway. I might as well just go back. He ends up going back, and now he is the heel known as the Hot Stuff. He got a new look. He's heavily influenced by Jerry Lawler, and he's working with him. And his career is definitely taken off to a better place. By 25 years old, he is a booker now for Mid-South Wrestling, and he is guiding wrestlers, up-and-coming wrestlers like Dr. Death Steve Williams, and even our boy Sting. Now, soon after, Bill Watts. Things ain't looking good, so he sells to WCW. Now, once he sells, they end up having Eddie become part of the booking committee over in WCW. However, everybody over there in WCW was just kind of feeling like they should do whatever the fuck they want to do. So here's Ric Flair, who's just like, well, I'm the head of the committee up in here. Great. Now he's head of the committee and he's booking things, and regardless of what everyone else is saying, Ric Flair pretty much is like, I got the last word. Now, here they are going back to Tennessee, and Eddie's having a match with Ron Simmons. Now, and here we are at the point where Eddie's just like, you know what? Ron should take the win. And Rick is just like, no, you're going to win. And he's just like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Now, up until that match happened, Ric Flair is thinking, all right, well, exactly what I said is what's going to happen. But actually, Eddie ends up changing the finish, and this makes Ric Flair so upset. He's so upset, he gets on the phone and make a phone call. He's calling someone to actually take the place of Eddie on the booking committee. And who does he call? His childhood friend, Jim Cornette, that he came up with in the business. Now, Jim, obviously he wants this job, but when he hears he has to replace his friend that he came to the business with, he's a little reluctant, but obviously ends up taking the job. Now, Jim Cornette says he was a little upset because Eddie told everybody that he thought he had the job up until he walked into that committee room and seen Jim Cornette sitting on his damn chair and realized that they let his ass go. Jim Cornette said, hey, look, I'm setting the record straight. That never happened. They called his ass. It told him that he was fired, so there was never him walking to the room, and I was there. They had already let him go at that point. Now, Eddie, he ends up going back to Memphis, and we have probably one of the most notorious moments within Memphis, well, USWA history, where the car was involved, where Eddie Gilbert is getting into it with Eddie Marlin and everybody. He's supposed to be leaving, and as he's leaving, here comes Jerry Lawler, who is pretty much like the sheriff in town and pretty much setting the law, telling Eddie to get the fuck up out of here. Now, while he's doing that, everybody and their mama is cheering out, Jerry, 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 Jerry. Whatever. Eddie gets into the car. Now, Eddie, he gets into the car and he ends up hitting Jerry. Was this part of the plan? Yes. And I found this to be interesting that he pitched this idea because in a way he was like, he didn't want to be in WWF because it was too much show business and not necessarily about the wrestling. And then he kind of takes that he didn't really want to be part of and brings it on over to Memphis as well. Whatever. Now he hits Jerry with the car. Jerry takes a nasty ass bump. I don't even think like it's him getting hit with the car that was bad. It's how he lands was really horrible. And with that being said, people at home, people in the audience, they seen this and they're just like, hell to the no, not Jerry King Lawler. They end up calling the police and they're saying, you need to charge Eddie with vehicular homicide or some shit. Like, people was going absolutely crazy about this, and this was not a good thing. Now, after this, we do have Eddie, who's going from promotion to promotion. Like, literally every few months, he's going somewhere else and he's being a booker, then moving on, then moving on, and moving on. In one of these promotions, he ends up meeting Missy Hyatt, end up working with her in the ring. She's a valet for him, and ultimately they became a couple. And not too long after, like very, very shortly after, they end up getting married. The time that they started their relationship to the time that they got divorced was literally around a year and a half, which is absolutely insane. Now, he ends up moving on to getting into a relationship with Medusa. He ends up tagging in a match with her, going against Mick Foley and Luna Vachon, which probably sound like a really good match. And they have their match, and they actually have really great chemistry with each other in the ring and even out the ring. And they started getting into a relationship, and not too long after, he's just like, girl, just marry me. And they end up getting married. And even that don't get too far in terms of them having a marriage. However, she stated that she was really happy, and whenever she was around his family, they were very welcoming, and she felt like this was a really, really great marriage to be part of. But unfortunately, due to the addiction with the painkillers, things didn't last too long. Now, everyone who knew Eddie, they said that even though he had these side effects to what they didn't know at the time to him taking painkillers. They just kind of felt like it was normal. Like sometimes people do things that would be abnormal for most people, but because you're always seeing them act a certain way or do certain things, that is just normal for them. And when he would have issues such as like falling asleep and kind of passing out randomly, people wasn't necessarily connecting the dots in terms of him having a pain killer addiction, and that was causing issues within his body. Now he got to the point where he approaches Medusa and he's just like, look, here are the divorce papers, sign it, I'm leaving, I gotta fix myself. Now, you would think that he actually would go on to fix himself, and that's not necessarily the case. He continues to have hardcore matches with Cactus Jack of all people. Now, Mick Foley said he did not know. He knew that obviously he's getting into these hardcore matches with Eddie, but didn't know what he was doing to medicate himself in terms of his addiction to painkillers. Like, people were taking them, but like other people were abusing them, and he had no clue. And to make matters worse, he moves to Philadelphia to go to guess where? To be part of Eastern Championship Wrestling, which ends up being Extreme Championship Wrestling, ECW. Now, he goes there. He's a booker. He's also a wrestler there. And he is, I guess you can say, he's definitely helping with making ECW more popular during the time. While he is there, here is Paul Heymon. Paul Heymon and Eddie, they have met when Heymon was a teen. So he knew of him and took Paul Heymon under his wing. And Paul Heyman is pretty much just being his shadow and watching what he does and learning from Eddie as he is booking, so he can be able to, be part of that team. Now, after 6-7 months into that relationship of Paul Heymon shadowing him, things are getting really bad in terms of Eddie's demeanor. He is getting worse and worse into his addiction. I don't think that people necessarily knew at this time. However, it's causing him to miss shows and to be completely unreliable. And with him being unreliable and Paul Heymon having been under his wing for half a year, he's taking quite a few things, and he's just like, you know what? I'm going to swoop on in and I'm going to get shit done. So now we are days away from the Ultra Clash pay-per-view, and Eddie pretty much gets his shit and bounce and don't really tell anybody. He doesn't really care. He's at that point where the addiction has consumed his life basically, and he leaves. Paul Heymon is taken over, and they're finding other people to replace him, including Kevin Sullivan, that he absolutely hates. Kevin ends up taking his place on the pay-per-view. Now, about a day or so before the pay-per-view, Eddie ends up calling Todd, and he's just like, he's apologizing. He said, look, yeah, I left. I want to come back. Please give me an opportunity to come back. And he comes back at the pay-per-view. No one knows this is actually happening. So when he comes on out, he's apologizing to all the fans, and everything seems sincere. And Todd is just like, yeah, whatever. He's out here apologizing. I think we all right. But Heymon ain't happy about this. And he's like, what the fuck he doing here? When he realizes he's here, he tells production, cut this dude's mic off. I don't want him saying a word. They end up cutting his mic, and that's literally it for Eddie. And Eddie ends up leaving, never coming back to WCW. And you guys already know the history in terms of where things went in terms of Extreme Championship Wrestling. Now, shortly after this, Eddie was not happy about how things had played out in terms of his wrestling career, and he wanted people to know his side of the story. And he ended up having what is considered to be the first shoot interview in pro wrestling history. I can't say that this was particularly the first one, but I guess people would consider this to be the first. Now, in this interview, he's breaking kayfabe. He's talking about things that people don't know about the business and what wrestlers would not want him to be talking about the business. And this is something that a lot of wrestlers had condemned at the time. This is like, I think 1994. And he's talking about things about the business. Now, a lot of people are just like, you are a second generation wrestler. Like, you would know better to be sitting in front of a camera telling people situations within the pro wrestling world. And it was interesting because people didn't like that. But not too long after, people do these interviews, and you see them all the time within the modern day in professional wrestling, people doing shoot interviews. And he ends up doing that interview, and I guess that was a way of him putting out exactly how he felt about his life. Now, shortly after that interview, Jim Cornette calls up his old buddy Eddie and says, "Hey, I'm over here at Smoky Mountain. Come on over and see what's up." Now he comes on over and he has a match with Ricky Morton. Everything went well, and things seem like it might be off to a great start in terms of Eddie working with Jim Cornette in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Now, he was supposed to come back for the following week, but then he gets a offer from Carlos Colon to work as a booker in Puerto Rico. And I'm not gonna lie, I probably wouldn't have said no my damn self. And he tells Ricky Morton about it, and Ricky's just like, "Look, if I don't see you next week, I know exactly where you at." Now, he ends up going to Puerto Rico, and that's the last time that Jim Cornette has seen Eddie Gilbert. Now, Eddie, he goes over, he's booking, and he seems to be having a great time. He even have a match with a bear. I believe that's the last match that he ends up having. Now, one day he calls his brother and he's telling him how it's like in Puerto Rico. And he's just like, "Doug, get your ass over here. It is on and popping up in here. You should come over here and wrestle and consider, continuing career here in Puerto Rico." Doug wasn't necessarily into doing that, but he was like, he was going to give it some thought. However, the next day, February 18th, 1995, his brother gets a call. Doug gets a call, and he is notified that his brother had passed away. Now, after autopsy, they do confirm that this is a heart attack, something related to his heart. Now, a lot of people who knew him and knowing about his addiction at that point, since he passed away, they can definitely connect the dots. And it was just like, well, he was taking a whole bunch of painkillers, and things like that will cause your heart to, unfortunately, fail or whatnot. And what's interesting is that 33 years old, if he didn't put it's not even the wrestling career, it's that he got into, doing the narcotics, and that was the catalyst in terms of his, health failing, and he ended up passing away at such an early age, really, really young. And Jim Cornette, I'm not the biggest fan of him. However, I felt so emotional watching him at the end, where he talks about how if Eddie was still alive right now, he would be a month older than him. And Jim Cornette is choking up, like trying not to cry. And it really gets you thinking, like, 30 years has passed since he had passed away, and what more he could have accomplished if he was still alive till this day. It's absolutely insane. I totally understand, like, wrestling, we love to watch it, but it hurts. I'm sure it hurts for them to do this day in and day out. And unfortunately, they fall into getting into these addictions. And if they don't take the painkillers, then they won't be able to do this the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. And unfortunately, for some, it ends up being the reason why they pass away so young. All right, you guys, if you did not see this episode, go ahead and check it out on Vice TV. They come on 10 Eastern on Tuesday nights. We still have a few more episodes left of the season, just 10 episodes total. Our next episode is about Billy Jack Haynes. That's going to be a very interesting episode. I really do enjoy this show. Sometimes I do wish they would talk a little bit more about the accomplishments of these wrestlers, but even when they don't, they provide like interesting commentary about these wrestlers' life, where you would actually want to go out there and do your own research to find out a little bit more, especially after hearing about the dark side of their lives. You guys, I'll see y'all next week for the next review. Bye.